Chapter 3. Friends on Guard. "What do you think these numbers mean, Nancy?" Mr. Howard asked, staring at the piece of paper inside the bisque figurine. "I haven't the slightest idea," she replied. "But surely it isn't a manufacturer's number. He would never seal it inside the statuette." Nancy tucked the paper into her handbag and asked Mr. Howard if he would mind gluing the figurines back together. She would return to pick them up later. Smiling at the jeweler, she said, "And don't you think, under the circumstances, that you ought to return Mrs. Boyd's money?" "By all means," the man conceded. "I'll send her a check at once." Later that day, when Mr. Drew returned from the Capitol, Nancy told him about the figurines. The lawyer complimented her for having settled the case so quickly and satisfactorily for Mrs. Boyd. "You'd make a good lawyer," he said, smiling. Nancy then told him about the imposter and the strange number inside the figurine. "Since Mr. Howard is going to turn the case over to the police, I'll copy it and give the original to Chief McGinnis. Ned and I are going to a tea dance later on today, and we'll stop at headquarters on the way." "Ned's home from camp?" Mr. Drew asked in surprise. "Pretty soft counselor's job he has at the boys' camp this summer." "Not so soft," Nancy replied, realizing she was being teased. "He has to go back right after the dance." Nancy asked her father what he had found out in Washington about the Fontaine case. "No adverse reports have ever come in on the couple," he answered. "The authorities will look into the matter from the foreign angle, and told me it's all right for us to take care of the situation here." "Good," Nancy said. "I think we should begin work at once." Mr. Drew smiled. "What do you suggest?" "Dad, I feel that the Fontaines should disappear in order to be safe. It will only be temporary, of course, until the mystery is solved. And it's possible that their going might send the writer of the note to the dancing school to check up on them," Mr. Drew added. "But where do you think the Fontaines should go?" Nancy looked at her father and said, "I'd like to bring them here." Hannah Gruen, overhearing this suggestion, threw up her hands. "Nancy Drew, that's asking for trouble. You'd better think twice before you invite them to this house." The lawyer agreed with Mrs. Gruen, but after some coaxing, Nancy won them both over by promising to keep the secret from all but their closest friends. She would phone the Fontaines at once, and if they agreed to the plan, she would go for them late that night. "And in case we're followed," the young detective said, "I'll find a way to throw whoever it might be off the trail." As Nancy finished speaking, the doorbell rang, and a moment later, Bess and George came into the living room. They were very much interested to learn that the brother and sister might come to live at the Drew home for a while. But Bess echoed Hannah Gruen's sentiments. "Please be careful, Nancy," she pleaded. Nancy promised that she would, then went to the telephone. When she reached the Fontaines, she outlined her plan to each of them separately. After a conference between the brother and sister, Henri said that they would like to accept, but were concerned about closing the dancing school. "I don't think that will be necessary," said Nancy. "I'll talk to you about that this evening when I pick you up. I'll meet you in my car in front of the school at 10 o'clock. "We'll be there," Henri promised. When Nancy rejoined Bess and George, the girls discussed the problem of the dancing school. Suddenly, Bess beamed and said, "I have an idea. I know a number of dancing teachers in town, and I'm sure I could get them to take some of the classes." Nancy suggested that she try immediately. While Bess was telephoning, George went upstairs with Nancy. The young sleuth showered and changed her clothes. As she was putting on a pale green tea dance dress, Bess came into the room, smiling. "All the older classes are taken care of," she reported, "but I couldn't find anyone for the small children." Nancy's face lighted up. "Why don't you and I teach them?" she suggested. Bess was excited. She had taken lessons since she was a tiny tot and knew all the steps that were taught to small children. Nancy, too, had spent many hours in dancing schools and was quite accomplished. "Then everything's settled," said George. "I'm glad you didn't ask me to do any teaching." Nancy and Bess laughed, knowing that George preferred outdoor sports to any form of dancing. "Now we ought to have a manager," said Bess. "I'll try to find someone to help us out." "Fine," said Nancy. "Let's go downstairs. Ned should be here any moment." He arrived a few minutes later. Ned Nickerson was a tall, athletic young man with dark, slightly wavy hair and a ready smile. "Hello, everybody," he said. "Any new mysteries?" "A couple," Nancy admitted. George's eyes twinkled. "In connection with one of them," she said, "we need a manager for a dancing school. Want to apply?" The athlete roared with laughter. "There's nothing I'd rather do," he said, striking a ballet pose. Bess giggled. "We're serious, Ned. We have to find a manager. Nancy will tell you all about it." After Ned had heard the story, he said, sighing, "I might have known you'd become involved in something like this. I can see our dates for weeks ahead being canceled. But seriously, I have a suggestion. Perhaps my mother could help out." "Wonderful!" Nancy cried. "Let's phone her." Nancy made the call and was delighted when Mrs. Nickerson accepted readily, promising to be at the dancing school the next day at 10 o'clock. The four young people walked out to where Ned's new green sports car was parked in the drive. As Nancy prepared to leave with him, George took hold of her arm. "Nancy," she said, "Bess and I will come back here tonight to help you. We'll patrol the street and try to steer any suspicious persons away from the house, so you can bring the Fontaines here unnoticed. If some such person should appear as you approach, we'll wave a white handkerchief." "That's a good idea," Nancy agreed. "Come early and we'll talk over the details." The cousins were back at the Drew residence by 9 o'clock. A few minutes later, Nancy returned from the tea dance. The three girls arranged that Bess and George would each patrol one side of the street. Should either of them see a person she thought was suspicious, she would give a low whistle to summon the other. Bess, who found it difficult to whistle, spent the next few minutes practicing. In the meantime, George was given a full description of the mysterious stranger who was suspected of having sent the threatening note to the Fontaines. "Suppose we see him. Shall we call a policeman?" George asked. "If there's one around," said Nancy. "Of course, we don't know whether or not this man we suspect is guilty, and we'll have to be sure not to do anything we might regret. If you see him, use some ruse to get him out of the way until after I return here with the Fontaines." Nancy went on to tell her friends that while she was at the dance, she had made further plans in an effort to throw enemies of the dancers off the trail. She had arranged with the pilot of a private plane for the couple to be flown from River Heights to another airport and then return by train. She would pick them up at the River Heights station. "In the meantime, I'll come back here," she said. "You'd better stay on guard all the time, though, in case I have to change the plans. If I'm delayed, I'll phone." Shortly before 10 o'clock, Nancy went for her convertible and drove off. Bess and George took up their stations on either side of the street. George, enthusiastic and energetic, wished something exciting would happen. Bess, on the other hand, found her heart pounding wildly and hoped fervently that she would not encounter anyone suspicious. The cousins expected Nancy to return about 11:15. Bess had just stopped under a streetlight to check her wristwatch, which said 20 minutes to 11, when she saw a vaguely familiar figure coming up the sidewalk. The man paused to light a cigarette, and in the flare his features were very distinct. There was no question but that he was the suspected stranger. Bess tried to whistle for George, but in her excitement could not make a sound. Close to panic, she turned on her heel, crossed the street, and summoned her cousin. After a quick explanation, the girls hurried toward the man. He was much too close to the Drew home for safety. "How can we get rid of him?" Bess murmured nervously. "I'll think of something," said George. She calculated the distance so the girls would pass the man under a streetlight and pretend to recognize him. They went by the stranger, then turned back, and George said, "I beg your pardon, but aren't you from Centrovia?" The man looked in amazement at the girl, but said quietly, "Why, yes, I am. Why do you ask?" "Oh," George answered glibly, "I've been looking everywhere for you. I want to write an article for the newspaper. Won't you come down to the hotel coffee shop so my friend and I can interview you?" The Centrovian was surprised at the request. As George spoke, she subtly had him fall in step with her, and they walked down the street together. Bess hurried along beside them, open-mouthed. "But I don't want a story about me in the newspaper," the stranger said. "Our readers would be fascinated by the fabulous life you've led," George went on, urging the man quickly along the sidewalk. By this time they had reached the corner. George glanced around for a policeman, but none was in sight. Suddenly the man stopped. "Say, what's going on here?" he asked, no longer in a pleasant voice. Bess and George were so taken aback that they did not know how to reply. "Well, I want to tell you both," the man went on angrily, "to mind your own business. If you don't, I'll report you to the police." Bess, panic-stricken, cried, "Let's go!" She grabbed George's hand and hurried down the street. The stranger strode off in the opposite direction and was soon lost to view. When the cousins reached the Drew home, George said, "Probably he's back here hiding behind some tree." This possibility heightened Bess's nervousness, and she wanted to give up her sleuthing at once. "We'll stick it out until Nancy gets back," George said crossly. "I'll sneak around to the garage through the next-door driveway and see if her car is there." Bess did not relish being left on the street alone. But no one came along, and in a few minutes George returned to report that Nancy had not returned. The girls took up their vigil again. When another 20 minutes had gone by and still Nancy had not come, Bess became exceedingly worried. She crossed the street and told George she was going in the house to find out if Nancy had telephoned. "I'll go with you," George said. She too was concerned now. They mounted the porch steps and rang the bell. Hannah Gruen, an alarmed expression on her face, opened the door. "Oh, I just know something has happened to Nancy," the housekeeper wailed. "I haven't heard a word from her." End of chapter 3.